Well, my name is Dwain Hensley, and I came to work for WKY-TV in January 1962. After a long history of working at the mental hospital in Norman and that sort of thing, prepared me very well, I think, for WKY-TV. And I came to work, interviewed with Dick Johns, and came to work in the Houston Fearless room, processing 16 millimeter movie film. And Jerry Manning done a great job of breaking me in and training me and that sort of thing. And of course, Johnny Shannon was really over the Houston Fearless room. And I learned a lot from Johnny. Fred Wolf was in the photography department. And you know, the Houston room was a busy place almost all of the time, because guys were running in with rolls of film that they'd shot that they had to have right now. So it was an interesting place to work. I can't remember exactly when the year was, but the president came to southeast Oklahoma to dedicate the Kerr-Magellan waterway. And Dick Johns fell in love with an old man over there in Poto. And because the old man was interesting and had lots of good stories, and Dick and the camera operator, the newsman that went with him, stayed till it was way late. But they still needed to get back to the station to do the 10 o'clock news, and they had this film they wanted to run. So when they started getting close to Oklahoma City, they realized they didn't have enough time to land at the airport, get the film to the station to be processed, and then get back to to get it on the air. So they came up with this harebrained idea that they would fly over the station out there, drop the film for me to process, and then by the time they got to the station, it would be done. So by the time they got there, it was dark. So how do you fly by a TV antenna sticking up in the air with all the down guys and this sort of thing, and not have a terrible wreck? Well, we decided we'd take all the news cars and put them out in the pasture beside the TV station and shine the lights towards each other. This would make 2 bars of light for them to see. So that's what they did, and dropped that film out there. Man, if the FAA had ever caught them, they'd have never got back in another airplane. But anyway, it worked out real well. How did I get my nickname? Dick Johns gave me that nickname. And I really thought for years and years and years it was because of my physical size. And then I decided, well, maybe it's because I bumbled around, rumbled through things and all that. Until I saw a show that Dick did one time called The Tank. And it was where they immersed him completely in body temperature fluid, took away all of his senses, and kept him in there for I don't know how long. But that name of that show was The Tank. So I've decided since then that maybe I'm such a dumb, dull guy that Dick decided that was my nickname, was Tank. So I have Dick Johns to thank for my nickname. Well, after some time in the Houston Fearless room, I discovered I could probably make a little more money if I worked on backstage. So I talked to the stage manager, and that was Jay Spivey, I believe, at that time. Ron King was assistant stage manager. And they decided I was probably all right to work backstage. So we moved backstage, and it was a lot different back there. Met a lot of interesting people who were stage people and artists, engineers, all were involved somewhere or another with stage work there. And Arnie Katoff was a real character that we've lost here recently, I understand. Did Foreman Scotty Adventures. We did in Studio C. Was a good place to get any kind of experience that you might need to further your career as whatever you wanted to be. If you want to be an actor or a carpenter or a mechanic or anything, there was always something going on backstage that you could be involved with. One of my favorite things there was the Foreman Scotty Adventures. Steve Powell, one of my favorite people in the world was Steve Powell. Taught me lots of things. I always drove old junk cars, and so something was always broke, and Steve would let me drive the Circle 4 Ranch Jeep when I needed to, which delighted the kids in my neighborhood. They all thought that I was some kind of superhero, I think. Actually, Ed Fazell was a superhero, but sometimes I got to fill in for Ed. Let's see, I can't remember what he was, captain something or other, flew the helicopter. We had all the Kansas City Star thing, where everybody had the supermarket parking lot and that sort of thing. We had things going on, and Ed was one of the key people in that sort of thing. As far as the Circle 4 Ranch Adventures that Scotty did, I played everything from a Roman soldier to a gorilla. And let me tell you what, if you think it don't hurt to get hit in the eye or the face with a chocolate cream pie, you're wrong. It hurts. Took us 2 or 3 hitches at that to get it right. I'm not sure why it would take so many, but it took a lot of takes, so to speak, to get that done. Finally, they decided shaving cream worked better anyway. But that was after I'd tested out banana cream pies, chocolate cream pies, coconut cream pies, anything you could think of. They settled on shaving cream. Well, we talked about the Foreman Scotty Adventures, playing Roman soldier to gorilla. Well, Dick Winters was my roommate and worked there too. We played guitars and that sort of thing. So Steve got onto this somehow or another, and he decided that Danny, who was Xavier T. Willard, needed to have a band for some reason or another, I don't know. So he devised Xavier T. Willard and the Willaroos. Well, all right, that was Dick Winters, Ron King, Tom Gilmore, who was announcer down at the radio station downtown, and myself. And we did various and sundry bits on Foreman Scotty Adventures. And of course, naturally, the people in the real world didn't understand that this was a put-together thing and was of no value or consequences at all, but they sent a 50-passenger bus to WKY-TV studios and asked anybody that wanted to get on that bus and come to Western Oklahoma to a charity thing for United Fund Drive. And they sent that bus and Dick Winters and myself and Tom Gilmore and a cousin of Tom Gilmore's from El Reno, who supposedly played the bass guitar, were the only ones that went. We went all the way out there, and they had this huge buffet set up for us. And like I said, we were the only ones there. We had plenty to eat and that sort of thing. I always felt bad about that, but I guess that's to be expected when you're rich and famous and have those things happen to you. you sometimes don't do everything that was expected of you. And we sure enough didn't send enough representation from WKY-TV to those folks' charity event. We came back from that United Fund charity event, and we had a wonderful time out there, a good meal and all that. We just didn't perform the way the folks really thought we would. But I skipped over Wilson Hurst. He was part of the band too. Cannonball McCoy, he was with Steve for years. And how Wilson got involved with that was he worked with Ward's at Penn Square, and he discovered Dick and I played, so he would get us to come to Ward's during Christmas time. We just wander around the Ward's and pick and grin, you know, play Wheels on the Bus and that sort of thing for the kids. And in Willie and the Willaroos, I had an old mandolin. Wilson didn't play anything, but he'd carry that mandolin around with him, and he was part of the band too. I'd forgotten that Wilson was part of the band. But we had a good time with it anyway, and I don't know why it ever went away, but it finally did, thank goodness. Didn't have it anymore. They got the Adventures. It was a major production to get those things done. We had to do them from the time we got the 6 o'clock news over with until the 10 o'clock news started. We had to get in Studio C and do that, those Adventures. And we'd try to do a week at a time, or as many as we could get. And we built sets out of no seam and stuff we gathered up off of the studio grounds and out of the warehouse and stuff like that. We hauled, sometimes we'd spend all afternoon hauling stuff in the studio, and then after the news and weather was over with at 10 o'clock, we'd have to move all that stuff out and set up for the next day when they did commercials in there. So it was quite an involved deal to get all that stuff done and in and out of the studio. We had to haul major things into that studio. We did live wrestling out of Studio C, and it was always a horrendous thing to get done because we had a huge ring that had to be put up in the middle of the studio, and one camera had to be torn down and put up on a scaffolding, and the other one ran the floor all the time, so it was okay. But it was a terrible job, horrendous job. It was fun if you like to do that sort of thing. And Danny Williams, he made it much more fun because he was always into it with one or the other wrestling and wrestler and that sort of thing. But in order to get this show on the air, they had a guy hired who would come in and put the ring together. But we had to put bleachers together around the walls, and they kind of folded up, and they were on a four-wheel dolly. You had to push and tug and wheel and get in there, and then you took it off the dolly, built it up, slid the boards in and all this. It was a terrible job to get it all done. Then we'd pull the curtains around the edge and this sort of thing. Needless to say that some of the wrestling crowd was not the most sophisticated that there was. And I remember one incident when I was running a floor camera, and the director, I don't remember which director it was, all at once went to screaming in the cans, and he hollers, "Tank, Tank, get a tight spot, left corner." And I looked around, and I finally found the guy and took a picture of it, and here's this guy had our curtains gathered up, blowing his nose on them like this. And the director about had a stroke, but there wasn't anything you could do about it. We had to take the curtains down later and send them in and have them dry cleaned. Always something going on that deal, on that particular night, Saturday night. There was always something going on because you had a crowd. Needless to say, the studio, storage facilities, Outback warehouse was a crowded place. And with the ring being back there and the bleachers being back there and all that sort of stuff, it took up a lot of room. But we had a disc jockey that worked in of course, the radio side upstairs, and he worked a midnight shift, so he was there all night. And so when we would take the stuff out of the warehouse, of course there was a bare spot in the warehouse. Well, this jockey, who drove a really fancy, nice car, I think it was a Corvette, he decided that these people coming in for wrestling was going to tinker with his car. So he would slip around and bring his car to the back and drive it up in the warehouse and park it in the warehouse. Well, you know, it was locked up in there, couldn't anybody get to it. Well, that's a good idea, good deal. The only thing is, when we tore the bleachers down, we didn't have any place to put them. See, we just have to leave them sitting out in the open area back there. And then somebody else the next day would have to put them up. Ed Fazell and Claude Maxwell had asked Johnny Dark not to park his car there because it posed a problem, a real problem for us. But, you know how those disc jockeys are, you know, he continued to do this. And so Ed and Claude had talked to Mr. Duskin about it, Phil Duskin about it. And Phil had told him, you know, don't park your car there, it's a hazard. Well, Johnny Dark, and being Johnny Dark, he continued to do it. So Ed and Claude, they figured this deal out just real handy. They had a little extra time one Saturday night after they'd got their regular work done. I'm sure they didn't do it on company time. They go out to the warehouse and they physically picked that car up and turned it around and set it back down in that studio. Now, I don't know how they did it. I think they probably figured out with a floor jack and all that, but they were pretty husky guys. They turned that car around. Well, needless to say, Johnny Dark about had a stroke over that deal and reported them to the powers that be and went upstairs and told Phil Duskin, you know, they had messed with his car and all that. And Mr. Duskin just told him, said, well, he should have been parking there in the first place. That was the end of that story. But I always drove old junk cars, you know. Well, there was a guy who worked there, I don't remember his name, but he overhauled a 50 model Mercury. That's the James Dean car, right? And so I thought that was really neat, you know. But he had trouble with it. It had overheat, and he just overhauled it. He couldn't figure out what was the matter. So I go out and look at it and determine the real problem was every time he'd give it to gas, the bottom radiator hose would collapse. Now, I didn't tell him. I just bought the car for $100. And we drove it around town here for a long time. And one Saturday night, we had some extra time, so we go out Northwest Highway, and we go out, ended up out west of El Reno. And got off out there in the middle of the night, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. This old car quit. So there we were. All my buddies were all out there with me. But Ed Fazell, he lived at El Reno. So I called Ed and asked him, you know, if there's any way he could come out and give me a hand. Now, Ed drove a little Fairlane, so it would happen to be a 4-door car. But Ed said, I'll be out there and get you. And he come out there and got us, and there was 6 of us. And they were sitting out there beside the road. And Ed picked us up and hauled us all the way back to Oklahoma City where we lived and all that. So Ed Fazell, he's got a special place in my book because he rescued me. Of course, he did overhaul his car in my front yard and conned my wife into making him an apple pie while he's doing it. I'm not sure just how that deal worked out, but she made him an apple pie. You know, it was fun working in Studio C, but Studio B had its perks too. It was a fun place to work. You know, we did live show 12:25 every day. I'm sure everyone knows on-the-air personality would come in and do do a 30-minute show or whatever. They had lots of live music and things like that was on. But this particular on-the-air personality was prone to partake of the grain on a pretty regular basis. One day, I think Arnie Katoff probably instigated the whole deal, but this particular on-the-air personality would drive in with his little foreign sports car and park in the back every day. And he would get out, come in and do the show. Before he came in, he'd kill a half pint of orange-flavored vodka. Tuned him up real well. Then he'd come in and do the show, and then when he'd leave, he'd go back out and kill the second half pint of orange-flavored vodka, and away he'd go. Well, one day, Ed Fazell, I'm sure he was involved with it, myself and a couple other guys, we go out and pick the back end of his little MG up, and Arnie puts blocks under the axle. So when the on-the-air personality came out and got in his car, he couldn't go anywhere. He sat out there and raced the motor. Of course, it was a lot of fun. It was hilarious. Pretty soon, though, we'd laughed so long and so hard, we decided we better go help him out. So we go out and give the car a shove, and away he goes. We never did do that anymore, but it was a fun time, and we had fun with that particular person. And things happen spontaneously in live television. On the air, things happen that you have absolutely no control over. And one of those things happened one night on the news set. We had gone through the news and all that, and the sports announcer, I guess it's all right for me to name him, his name's Ross Porter. Excellent news broadcaster. But he memorized everything he said. He never would glance down at his paper. But he always had it. And he would sit there and he'd do the news of the sports. One day, an extraneous fly got in the studio. And he did a number on Ross. I mean, literally did a number on Ross. He crawled all around and all around. Now, I was on the weather camera that night, and I think John might have been on the news camera that night. But anyway, John Spence, very nice fellow. The director was having a stroke. Get a fly swatter, we gotta get a fly swatter, get that fly. And you could hear him outside the cans. And I knew that was distracting Ross, even though the fly wasn't. It was crawling around on his face and all around. And he never brushed at it or anything. He just let it go. So I would go out the back door of the studio to find a fly swatter. There was probably 500 fly swatters around that area, but I couldn't find one. The only one I could find was one in the art department, hanging on the wall in the art department that I'm pretty sure Arnie had made, and it was made from a piece of screen wire about this wide and had a long handle on it. It was probably 3 foot long. So I thought, I can get that fly with this. So I go back in the studio. Well, the weatherman, Bob Thomas, had already come into the set and was drawing on the set, all these little stuff and everything. But he sees me go by the back of the camera with this fly swatter on my shoulder. I don't know how we ever got through the weather that night, because it broke Bob Thomas up so bad that he went out the back door before we got to him because he was laughing so hard. And he came back in, and like I said, I don't know how we ever got through the weather. We never did get to fly. It may be still in that studio out there as far as I know. But that happened I know that it's unreal to think that happened, but it really did happen. I was there that night and saw it, and I'm sorry to say that I was the cause of Bob Thomas being broke up that night, but he really was. For some reason or another in the Studio B, during the Paxton show, Lester Tucker got on the close-up camera. We had a wide-angle camera and a close-up camera. and Mr. Tucker was on the close-up camera. Well, we were always finding these little snakes about so long in the studio that would come in and they'd get around our cables and stuff like this. Lester Tucker is deathly afraid of snakes. He just was, that was his thing. So we were on live, and this little snake comes in, and somebody pointed it out to Tucker. He saw that snake, he just backed up against the wall and locked his camera in, took his cans off, and exited the studio. There I am by myself in the studio with 2 cameras. Of course, the director, he had no clue what happened, you know. But we finished out the show. Thankfully, we were able to finish out the show there, and everything was fine. And I didn't know till later that Mr. Tucker was afraid of snakes, so afraid of snakes. I myself am afraid of snakes. I think all snakes are poisonous, all bugs bite. It's kept me alive and well for 72 years. I had a little run-in with a snake in Studio C one time. We always did the zoo parade, wasn't that what it was called? Something like that. And Bob Jennings always brought out critters and this sort of thing. But he was pretty prone to bring mostly snakes. And this particular day I was running the close-up camera. We were doing a zoo parade, and he brings out the snake boxes. Everybody knows what a snake box looks like. It's got a sliding door on it. It's got a snake hook, you know. And he pulled out 3 or 4 snakes out of this one box. He pulled 2 or 3 rattlesnakes out, and he put them on the floor, and he torqued their jaws up and messed with them, and he put them back. Well, he put these rattlesnakes back, and he said, I found this little fella out this morning, and he slid the door back on that box. Well, I've got a close-up on that box, you know, and I just saw this snake go like that, and it came across the floor and right towards my camera. So I tilt down and start backing up, and I don't ever catch up with a snake. Pretty soon I just figured out it's gone under my pedestal, and I think it's going to come out the other side where I'm at. So I climbed up on the pedestal and up on the steering ring on the pedestal, and I still never found a snake. So I finally decided it's gone somewhere else and looked up to get down, and here's the other camera on a wide shot on me standing on this pedestal. Everybody thought that was screamingly funny. I, on the other hand, did not think that was funny in any way, shape, or form. But they did. They kept it on a goof reel for a long time, and once in a while I'd see it on a bit that they was doing, but I don't know whatever happened to it, but John might find it. It was a funny bit from the other side. It wasn't so funny on my side. We used to do country social out at Studio C, and for years they did it live and all that. Then eventually we decided we'd tape it, and did tape it. But Jude and Jody was the main band, and Don Mathis and Bud Mathis would do bits on there every once in a while. So one time they decided, they got the harebrained idea that Dick Winters and I would come around and we'd pick and grin on Country Social, and Bud and Don would run the cameras. So we worked this deal up. We'd split a song. Dick could play part of it and I'd play part of it. And so Bud and Don would go around and run the cameras. So we go around to do this, and like I said, this is during the times when we did those shows live. So we come around, and as we come around in front of the camera, my cord on my guitar kind of hung. I give it a little flip. Naturally, I shouldn't have done that because it pulled the end off the guitar cord. You plug it in the amplifier. So as I went by Dick, I just told Dick, you know, you're going to have to play both parts because I screwed my guitar up. Which he did. He was a pretty good guitarist. We played, I don't know, Under the Double Eagle and Wildwood Flower or something. We were really slick at that. Played that deal. And Bud and Don, they were out behind the cameras taking shots of lights and everything else in the world. Just didn't work out real well at all because they imprint on the tubes, you know, and you'd have this terrible spot. But anyway, we got through it, all that sort of thing, and eventually, sometime after that, The Country Social people, they kind of broke up. Jude and Jody went their way and started their own store and their own show and that sort of thing. Bud and Don decided they would revise Country Social and they would get a named star in to do the show. So that was a pretty good deal because us poor old guys working in the studio, we got to meet a lot of people. Big stars, George Jones and Buck Owens and Roger Mathis, and no, not Roger Mathis, I don't know, Roger Miller and that sort of thing. And when they'd bring these people in, they would do spots on the Paxton show too. And so we got a lot of stuff come in the studio, a lot of people come in the studio that we got to meet. And of course they would come in and they would do 4 or 5 shows at a time, and they did them originally out of the generic set, the Country Social set. And then they was going to build a better set later on. One time George Jones came in the studio to do his 4 or 5 shows. And on the way into town, the luggage carrier on his bus came open, and he lost his guitar out of that case and all, man, just fell out. So they came in there, when they started unloading, they discovered that George's guitar was gone. So I lived just a few blocks away by that time, and I said, I'll go home and get my guitar and we'll do these shows with my guitar, which we did. He played my old Sunburst Red Gretsch guitar for those 5 shows. I thought that was nice of me to do that. Anyway, then Roger Miller came in one time, and he was doing on the Paxton show, and Tom Paxton, you know, he was one of these guys that would always ask embarrassing questions on the people, you know. And he asked Roger Miller how he came up with these ideas for these songs. Roger said, well, they just kind of come to me. He told about a song or 2 he wrote in a matter of a couple of minutes, you know. Paxton said, you mean you wrote that song in 2 minutes? Yeah. Roger told him, yeah. He said, well, could you write a song now? And Roger says, well, sure. And he said, well, okay. Write us a song. He said, well, okay. 3 things you can't get from a calf: buttermilk, sour cream, and half. I thought that was a pretty good song myself. Anyway, we saw lots of people come through the studio, and they finally ended up selecting Buck Owens to do the Country Social. So that's the set that everybody remembers. It's a huge set, took up 2 walls in the studio that they built the sets from scratch and painted them all. It was a wonderful, great big set, and they syndicated that show. And every once in a while, even today, I'll see that show in a syndication somewhere that we did right here at this studio. But when they did the original set, then they charged Ray Murdoch, who was the lighting director at the studio at that time. They charged Ray to light this set, and like I said, it was a huge set, so that meant he had to move all of the lights in the studio around. We had one area that we did most of the commercials at that had a 5 kW as the key light and a couple of 2s as fill light and then some floor fills. But he had to move all that around, and typically they'd crank the air conditioner way down on those things overnight, and then the lighting man would come in early and be by himself lighting the commercial. Well, I happened to be doing the mornings show in the other studio and would come in at 5:30 of a morning. So one morning I came in, and for some reason, I don't know why, I went into Studio C, and there hung Ray Murdoch from the light grid on 2 S-hooks, and the ladder was way off over there. He would get up on that ladder. We all did this, and safety people would get you now if you did it. But we'd hook that light grid and pull ourselves along and catch it with another thing like this and pull it over. Well, Ray had pulled himself over, and he hadn't hooked on yet over here, and he hung up over here, so he was shaking it, getting it loose, and the ladder rolled out from under him. And there he was hanging from that light grid 15 feet off of the floor. So I go over and get the ladder and push it back over to him. And his hands, where he'd been hanging, he must have been hanging there 10 minutes by the time I got there. But his hands was all messed up and everything. He really had trouble with his hands for a little while after that. Dangerous to work in that studio, I guess. I learned a lot of wonderful things working in Studio C or working at WKY. There were so many talented people at WKY-TV that I really don't know how they gathered them up. Danny Williams, you know, he did 3D Danny for years and that sort of thing. And all of that stemmed from when the Russians put up Sputnik, I think. Anyway, they built all of those sets for 3D Danny and all this. Well, at the same time, every year at the State Fair, they would have a booth. It was a WKY-TV booth. And one year we did a spaceship. You could go out and go in the WKY-TV booth and go in and you'd take a space flight. Well, we did all of that. The visual parts of it we did in Studio C. And the art department took styrofoam balls and they painted them different colors. And of course they still do it. Green screens, things. They did green no-seam all around the back wall and the side walls. And they hung these styrofoam balls painted different colors from the light grid in the studio. We took a camera and dollied and panned and tilted and cranked up and down, went through all these balls as if you were traveling through space and going by all of these things as you go. So it was really colorful and was a pretty good illusion. They took that and the carpenter, Jack Wilkinson, built a spaceship out at the fair. And it was on I don't know how they devised it. Anyway, it would tilt up and down and sideways and forward and back and all this sort of thing. And they put a electric motor on the side of it with a wheel on it that was out of balance. And the guy operating it, of course, was up on the roof. And the guy operating it usually was one of the cameramen from the station that would go out and run this thing for him. And they would start off, you know, and they had a fan in the deal. You'd turn the fan on for a little bit and it'd blow in your face, and you'd turn the wheel on a little bit and it'd vibrate and all this. And by the time you got through with this thing, you really felt like you had been picked up and transported and brought back and set down just through the illusion of what you felt in your seat and air blowing on you and what your eyes saw ahead of you. And I always thought that was unique until I went to an air museum in Mobile, Alabama. And they had a very similar setup that you went in that gave you the illusion of flying in an airplane. And it was almost identical setup to what we'd done years before that out at the fairground. Like I said, I learned lots of things at WKY-TV that I've learned and used later in my life. I enjoyed the people I met there, and I got to doing the farm show of a morning. And one day, Nelson Robinson came in and he said, "Do you intend to do this the rest of your life?" And you know, I hadn't really thought about it. I think I made $52.66 a week take-home pay. But by that time, I had a wife and family started. And I told him, you know, I really need to make a little more money. So he said, well, Ralston Purina, who was one of our sponsors on the morning show, is looking for a salesman. And he said, I think you'd fit right in with them. You're a farm boy, you know about farm work and things like this. He said, why don't you go down and talk to them? So, you know, I studied about it a while, and I went down and they sent me through 2 full days of testing. And then they interviewed me, and they hired me, and they told me that I was the only salesman they'd ever hired that didn't have a college degree. I thought that was a pretty good deal, and I want to thank Nelson today for putting me onto that deal. That was a good time in my life. I sold dairy feed from out of the Purina mill down there for several years. But I went on from there to do other wondrous things, but I have never been in a situation where my time at WKY-TV didn't do me a good turn.